This is the most comprehensive review of the Surface Pro 11 in comparison against the other new Snapdragon laptops, the Intel ones, and the MacBooks. Honestly, the Surface Pro seems like the perfect device for students or anyone who needs to handwrite sometimes. It's almost exactly what I would have wanted when I was going to school. And with the new ARM processor, it really brings a new level of performance in terms of speed and efficiency to finally be competitive against the MacBooks, and even beating it in some ways. But there are still some annoying issues and caveats you should know about Windows on ARM. I think the Surface Pro is definitely the most interesting new laptop, because the switch to the new Snapdragon X Elite processor benefits it the most. In the past, the Surface Pro was full of compromises. The thin chassis and the attempt to also be a tablet left it with cooling that was never quite enough. It was almost always louder, hotter, and had less battery life than other comparable laptops. I have more detailed tests of the new processor later, but the efficiency gain is definitely real. And if you get the Surface Pro with the OLED display, you also get the bigger battery at 52 watt-hours, which is about the same as the larger Surface laptop and the M3 MacBook Air. So the biggest drawback of the Surface Pro is now practically gone. But why even bother with this form factor? You can't even use it on your lap that comfortably. Because it was much better than I thought. First of all, it can work as a tablet with a built-in kickstand, which is great for taking notes. The kickstand can prop it up at all sorts of angles, so you can get a more comfortable writing position. And now since the keyboard is wireless, you can even put it on the side and type notes when needed. This would have been so useful when I was in school, and it's so much nicer than a traditional two-in-one when you have to be constantly flipping it to go between writing and typing, or bring another keyboard. And you can also use it like this. This might look janky, because it is. But I have seen so many people, especially college students, in their dorm with a laptop on a stand and another keyboard in front of it. Having the laptop screen higher does help with posture and comfort, but now you have two sets of keyboard and mouse taking up half the table while the screen is miles away and much smaller. Compared to that, this is pretty elegant. You can even adjust the angle. Okay, but I have seen this metal stand that slots into the kickstand that does the same thing. But just propping it up on any random box still makes this a much more ergonomic experience, especially if you're not going to get a monitor. So if you're considering getting the Surface Pro, you should definitely consider the new Flex keyboard. It now supports Bluetooth and has this little tab thing that can fold over on itself, so you can have it at an angle even when you're just using it detached. It's reasonably solid feeling when angled up, but there's definitely a bit of flex, as its name would suggest. But you can always just lay it flat. And finally, the trackpad is now haptic. That's actually a pretty big deal. It means you can click anywhere on the trackpad with the same amount of force. If you type with your fingers, mostly at the home row, it's really natural to just use your thumb to click the top part of the trackpad. This lets you navigate around while not having to move your hand. But the top part is the hardest part to click on a traditional diving board trackpad. This is so much better now, and the trackpad is also quite a bit bigger than the old one. Now let me show you a magic trick. This is the back of the pen, and now it's the front. The Surface Slim Pen is very flat, but it works pretty well. It's pressure and tilt sensitive with barely any diagonal jitter. The side button is useful, and the bottom part can work as an eraser and shortcut button when you click it. However, it rattles a lot and makes the pen feel kind of low quality. This also brings me to the first annoying issue with the Surface Pro, and that is the pen digitizer they use is very visible. Basically, it's a layer that helps track the pen's position. It sits in front of the display, and you shouldn't be able to see it. However, on the Surface Pro, it's particularly visible. If you look very closely, you can see these tiny little dots, and they're most noticeable on a white background. It can be pretty distracting, but I don't think it got any worse compared to older Surface devices, which also means that it hasn't gotten better, while basically everyone else is doing a much better job of hiding the pen digitizer. You can't see any of it on the S24 Ultra or the iPad. Another issue with the screen is that it practically has zero anti-reflection coating, so it's very reflective. The new OLED brings you infinite contrast, but even in a moderately well-lit room, you end up having worse contrast than anything with a decent anti-reflection coating. Here it is next to the MacBook. Even with just an LCD screen, it looks better. The OLED is more impressive at night, but most of the time, you're probably not using it in the dark. But beyond those two issues, the screen is good. It's high resolution and 120 Hz. Combined with the fast pixel response time of OLED, it feels very smooth, especially when writing on it. The Surface form factor also does several things a lot better than conventional laptops. The first is speaker quality. I don't get why there aren't more laptops that have decent sounding speakers. It sounds better than most other laptops, including the Surface laptop, and also the M3 MacBook Air. These speakers are so clear, it makes the MacBook Air sound like it's firing the sound from a tiny gap and then bouncing it off the display, which it actually is doing. Another aspect is the cameras. It has a 4K webcam, which is kind of rare, but whatevers. What's more useful is actually the back camera. Not for taking pictures of yourself, but if you're going to school, the ability to take pictures of a whiteboard and scan documents is super nice. There's even a function that automatically corrects for the distortion and gives you a perfect scan. The rest of the device is pretty normal. There are 2 USB 4 ports, which can also work as a display port, but I've been having lots of trouble running a 4K 120Hz monitor off of it. I'm only getting 4K 60 with a USB-C cable that came with the monitor, and connecting to my TV with HDMI also only gave me 4K 30 at most. The X Elite processor is supposed to be capable of 4K 120Hz, but maybe some updates were needed or a different dongle. And you might not even notice this, but there's a tiny little door that if you push on it, reveals a tiny SSD so you can upgrade the storage. Overall, the physical aspect of the Surface Pro is very different, but I think it's quite nice, especially for students or just if you like to handwrite. But what really makes or breaks it is a processor. It might not seem like it, but this is far from the first attempt of Windows on ARM. Remember the first 2 generations of Surface Pro X? Yeah, me neither. So what is ARM? It's a reduced instruction set from what we're used to on laptops, but it's already been adopted by Apple Silicon laptops, and it's been on phones and tablets for a while now. The downside of the switch is that older apps must be run in emulation, which costs performance, unless the developer puts out a native version for ARM. The previous attempt of Windows on ARM was done with processors that were slower than the contemporary Intel ones. Plus, with the additional overhead of the emulation, the performance was just not it. So it was never adopted by the masses, and therefore most developers were never going to make a native version of their app. Apple's switch to ARM worked because they committed their entire lineup to it. And of course, their processor was really good, and the emulation worked quite well too. Now, Microsoft has kind of done the same thing with their entire Surface lineup going to ARM. And the other laptop brands have also committed themselves, at least partially, to making ARM computers. So hopefully this is a good sign towards a more mainstream adoption and therefore more native apps. My editing software DaVinci Resolve has already put out a native ARM version. For the non-native apps, you do need the emulation, and I'll talk about the performance of that later. But I do believe that this time is different, and these Windows on ARM computers are here to stay. Plus, the new Snapdragon X Elite is actually just plain old faster. It's faster than its Intel counterparts and even the M3, at least in the Geekbench multi-core. And on these Surface devices, plugging it in essentially has no effect on the performance, but the power setting does have a very significant impact. These tests are run on the best performance mode, and it's still 9% behind the M3 in terms of single core and 20% behind in terms of the GPU. However, I would almost never leave it in this mode because the lower power modes are so much more efficient. While playing back a 4K video on best performance mode, it's consuming 12 watt. But if you drop it to the recommended mode, which is the lowest power setting on Surface devices, it's only using 6 watts, which is on par with the M3 MacBook Air. And even in this mode, it's still quite fast. It scores about 83% of its best performance mode, and it's also still faster than the Intel Ultra 7 processor. I think having it in the recommended mode is perfectly fine for most daily tasks. It plays back 4K 60 videos with almost no drop frames. And in the recommended mode, the battery life is insane. The Surface Pro even beat out the M3 MacBook Air when running a video playback test, lasting 11 hours, whereas the M3 MacBook Air only did 8.5 hours. All the laptops are at around 70% brightness. But if you leave it in the best performance mode, it actually only lasts 5 hours. That's such a huge difference. It almost feels like the best performance mode is only there so that they can put out a bigger number on Geekbench than the M3. I would just stick with the recommended or the better performance when unplugged. But if we look at the Intel Ultra 7, it's using 17 watts to play back the same 4K video in its lowest power mode. And it also only lasted 4 hours playing the same 4K videos. So it doesn't matter what power mode you're in. It's very clear that the new Snapdragon X Elite processor is just on another level in terms of efficiency, which also translates to fan noise. There's basically none when doing most tasks. But when the fans do run, they are very quiet. The X Elite is not really beating the M3. It more so feels like maybe M2, but with a larger power budget to compete with M3. The only complaint I have is when running an external display when plugged in. The display gets pretty hot to the touch and the fans do run, which is fine for most cases, but if you're trying to write on it at the same time, it can make your hands pretty uncomfortable. Microsoft really gotta give us some level of fan control, maybe just a setting to run the fans faster to keep it cooler as a writing surface. The last concern about the overall performance is emulation. Microsoft did develop a new emulation layer that's supposed to minimize performance loss in the new Windows 11 update. The new layer also lets you emulate both 32 and 64-bit apps. And it works okay. The native ARM version of Chrome scored 28 on Speedometer, but I also tested an emulated version of Chrome, and the score went down to just 6. It does feel way less snappy to use, but it does still work. So I wouldn't really worry about needing to emulate an app like Slack. But if you need to emulate an app that's more demanding, I wouldn't bank on using emulation to run it. When I tried to run an emulated version of DaVinci Resolve, it just crashes. But given the way that the industry is moving, I think native apps will come pretty soon. And finally, if you're thinking about getting this to use primarily as a tablet, it's still not the best. Navigating Windows 11 with just your finger is just not a great experience. Lots of buttons are just not that touch-friendly, such as the Show Desktop shortcut in the corner that's really easy to trigger with your palm when you're just holding it. And there are also some pretty random bugs, like sometimes the on-screen keyboard won't show up. But if you're thinking about getting a tablet mainly to watch videos and take notes, then it's perfectly adequate. The window snapping at the top is easy to use, and GoodNotes and OneNote works great for note-taking. Now, one thing I didn't mention this entire time is AI, because most of it isn't that cool. The onboard AI compute power does have some pretty cool uses, such as accelerating object tracking in DaVinci Resolve, and the built-in camera scanner features and portrait blur during a video call. I actually really like this. It gives you a more natural background blur and it works quite well. But the rest of it, like the eye contact, is kind of a solution looking for a problem. It feels very creepy. And when it comes to image generation, even the biggest and best models running on the cloud are low-key not that great. So the tiny model here running on the device is predictably kind of bad. I mean, the results here speak for itself. Overall, the new Snapdragon laptops do feel like a new generation of laptops that doesn't really resemble the past failures of Windows on ARM. It's much faster and efficient, not the destroyer of Apple Silicon yet, but that's okay. The recommended power mode offers a good trade-off between speed and efficiency, and the form factor is surprisingly versatile. But it lacks a bit of refinement, especially the display having no anti-reflection coating, and the very visible pen digitizers are big L's. But what's not an L is liking and subscribing.